Hello, and welcome to the NRDC Impact Lounge at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival. I'm Daniel Heinerfeld from NRDC, one of the world's leading environmental advocacy organizations. Along with Cheryl Sleen, I direct Rewrite the Future, an initiative to help Hollywood tell stories about the climate crisis. And this is Beyond Apocalypse, a panel discussion about alternative climate futures in film and TV. NRDC is thrilled to present Beyond Apocalypse in partnership with the Sierra Club, the Good Energy Project, Variety, and the Writers Guild of America East. We now face the real possibility that natural feedback loops will cause runaway climate change, beyond our ability to control. For decades, groups such as NRDC and the Sierra Club have helped make environmental laws and regulations, and we've enforced them in the courts. That is necessary, but it is not sufficient to bring about the scale and speed of change we need. To do that, we must transform the cultural narrative that tells us climate change is not urgent or even real, that it's too expensive or too big to fix, or that it's already too late, that the only future awaiting us is one of disaster and apocalypse. We see that last idea reflected often in film and TV. A depleted civilization plagued by scarcity and violence, the prospect of another planet our only salvation. A bleak future is possible, especially considering the path we're on, burning ever more fossil fuels as ice melts, oceans rise, and fires burn. But apocalypse is not our predetermined fate. It is a choice, and storytellers have the unique opportunity to help us make a better choice. The stories we tell ourselves really matter. According to Anthony Leiserowitz at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, even those Americans most concerned about climate don't really know what they as individuals or we collectively can do about it. As he puts it, perceived threat without efficacy of response is usually a recipe for disengagement or fatalism. Professor Leiserowitz calls this the hope gap. To bridge the hope gap, we need stories that show us a better future is possible. What could our world look like in 30 years if we worked together to solve the climate problem? Perhaps we could do more than simply avert disaster. Perhaps we could create a better society, one that is more just and equitable, one that prizes caring and community over heedless consumption, a society in harmony with nature. But to get there, we need help envisioning it. And that's what our discussion is about today. How can Hollywood help us see and feel and therefore build a better, more inspiring future and keep us entertained along the way? It's now my honor to introduce our moderator, the writer, activist, and host of the podcast How to Citizen with Baratunde, Baratunde Thurston.
Thank you, Daniel, for that great introduction. I'm Baratunde Thurston, writer, host, activist, and citizen. I'm honored to moderate this panel of illustrious humans who are helping us rewrite the future. We've called this Beyond Apocalypse, and to be honest, part of me is like, but the apocalypse is coming, right? I mean, we survived an insurrectionist attack on the Capitol. I'm still thinking that the documentary that is the Terminator series is gonna come true eventually. There's a lot of folks out there who don't see these as good signs. I may be one of them. So is someone justified in saying, Exhibit 17 for Team Apocalypse story writers, where's that panel? But that's not the end of the story. Just because things feel and often are tough doesn't mean those are the only stories we can tell. History can serve as a bit of a guide. During slavery, we told stories not just about being slaves. During World War II, we didn't just have tragic and sad war stories. And during COVID-19, we don't just have pandemic stories. We also have Ted Lasso, which we all desperately deserve and need. So I am excited to introduce a panel, a team of future rewriting storytellers, contributing to that place that we might get to if we can just imagine it better. Rosario Dawson has starred in a range of films and television, including Unforgettable, Top 5, 7 Pounds, Rent, and The Mandalorian. She will next star in HBO Max's pilot DMZ, directed by Ava DuVernay. Rosario is an activist and designer and also co-founded Voto Latino to help empower Latino millennials to vote and influence change in the government. Welcome, Rosario.
Thank you.
As the executive secretary of the UN Framework on Climate Change from 2010 to 2016, Christiana Figueres oversaw the delivery of the historic Paris Agreement. Today, she is the co-founder of Global Optimism, co-host of the podcast Outrage Optimism, and is the co-author of the book, The Future We Choose. Welcome, Christiana.
Thank you. Thank you, Baratunde. Good to be here.
Dorothy Fortenberry is currently an executive producer on Extrapolations, Apple TV's new climate change series from Scott Z. Burns. She's worked as a writer and producer on Hulu's award-winning adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale since its first season. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Disclaimer, we went to high school together. Sarah Treem is the co-creator and showrunner of the Golden Globe-winning Showtime drama, The Affair. She's currently working with Gal Gadot on a limited series for Apple TV based on the life of actress and inventor Hedy Lamarr, and is adapting the novel Rodham into a series with Hulu. Her Golden Globe-winning Showtime drama, The Affair, is one of the few shows that has directly addressed climate in a near-future storyline set on Montauk and Long Island. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
So, we're here. The future definitely needs some rewriting, and I have so much to ask each of you. Christiana, I'd like to start with you, and on behalf of the human species, start with gratitude. Thank you for your work on the Paris Climate Agreement. You're looking out for all of us, and we appreciate you having humanity's back. In your book, The Future We Choose, you lay out two paths that we can take. Essentially, one if we make the terms of the Paris Agreement, and one if we miss. And if we miss, it's a pretty dark and dystopic future. It's not fun. It's uncomfortable. But if we make it, there's a whole new world, almost literally, open to us. Can you describe some of what that world could look like if we meet the terms of this agreement or even exceed them?
Yeah, I mean, the reality here, Baratunde, is that both worlds that we describe are entirely possible from this moment when we're looking down the pike at the next 10 years. And if we, over the next 9 or 10 years, by 2030, if we continue along the path that we have had for almost 100 years of total environmental responsibility, then we will be in a world that irretrievably will be a world of destruction, pain, economic and physical destruction, and human misery, the likes of which we have never seen. However, if over the next 9 years, and I use 9 because it's already 2021, if by 2030 we are able collectively, all of us, to cut down our damaging emissions that are polluting the atmosphere to 1/2 of where they are now, then we open the door to a world that not just avoids the dystopia, the destruction, and the misery, but actually is a much better world. Because it's a world for those who live in cities, a world of cities that are green, that are clean, that are not congested, the world of a city that is much quieter because the internal combustion engine will be in the museum as opposed to on the streets. It will be a world in which we produce a lot of food locally, right there in our backyard or front yard. It will be a world in which transport is efficient. It will be a world in which we have clean, ubiquitous, and cheap energy available to everyone. What that means is 800 million people around the world who do not have electricity today and hence are in absolute abject poverty, they would be able to rise out of the poverty line because they would have the basic, which is electric power. So it is a much, much better world. And we stand before this Y in the road in which we have to choose. This is not something to sleepwalk ourselves into, but rather to wake up and realize that we are making the choice, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we're conscious or not. If you consciously don't choose, you walk down the dystopian path. But if we consciously choose to mend our ways, then we stand before the most incredible opportunity in the history of humankind to actually be able to intentionally create the quality of life that we will bequeath to our children and their descendants.
I want to thank you for use of the word bequeath. I also want to thank you for talk about storytelling. The scary picture you painted was pretty scary. You said human misery on the scale of which we've never seen before. So way to not hold back. But also on the other end, the idea that the combustion engine could end up in a museum of great human mistakes, for example, is a pretty enticing lure to that path. Dorothy, you've been writing and producing stories in this business for a minute, and we don't see many of either type of climate story, positive or negative, in most of what comes out of the industry. Why do you think that is? What's your take on that?
I think some of it is the way that we had historically shown climate. If you look like The Day After Tomorrow, like sort of the 90s climate movie, it was always a disaster. So I think the idea was climate change is natural disasters. And I think that kind of storytelling meant that if someone wasn't in the middle of a natural disaster, they felt like, well, I'm not in the middle of climate change. And what I hope now, where we are in the first chunk of the 21st century, is we can realize that climate change is impacting all of us all the time in all of our choices. And of course, it will mean devastating wildfires and monsoons and droughts, and it will mean those sort of big, epic, Hollywoody disasters. But it will also mean smaller things. It will mean, an apple farmer whose apples aren't germinating the way that they used to, and he's stuck with this apple farm that doesn't work right. It will mean a grandparent who has a lake that always froze over, not being able to go ice skating on that lake with their grandchild. It will be these smaller but very real losses of how we tell time, how we communicate family legacy. In all kinds of cultures and all kinds of places, nature is incredibly tied to how we collectively understand ourselves. And as that nature changes, we lose that sense of self. So I think we avoided it because we only saw it as giant and scary and monstrous, and sort of, that was what climate change was. But my hope is that as we see it as smaller and human, we can recognize that it impacts every single story. Every single show on TV right now has the potential to be a climate change show.
That's well said. And I want to show an example of that right now. Let's roll a clip from The Affair, set 30 years into a climate-changed future.
Your garden levels are off. Warning, sensor error. Your garden levels are off. Warning, sensor error. Your garden levels are off. Warning, sensor error. Your garden levels are off.
Check oxygen.
Warning, sensor error. Your garden
I said
levels
check
are off.
oxygen.
Warning, sensor error. Your garden levels are off. Warning, sensor error.
The idea is that there would be these sort of gardens, internal gardens that could be supplying oxygen to houses, while also growing food for the houses. And that is definitely based on some real science and some things that are sort of already in existence, not necessarily to provide oxygen, but this idea of internal gardens for houses, and that could an internal garden, city gardens and stuff like that. But what we were trying to do for the show, and what I think is it's interesting to think about when you think about incorporating climate change into narratives, is that people are very worried actually about climate change. It's a real anxiety, and it's hanging over all of us. And we're all kind of in denial about it, because it's too scary to think about. It involves the legacy of our children. It involves like the world that we're leaving them. We don't actually feel like we have any control over it. And so, but that kind of anxiety is a real character motivator. Like anything else, like any other kind of thing that the character is in denial about, like any other thing that the character doesn't want to see. But is significantly influencing their actions. It's very much something that you could incorporate into character, which is the thing that I think in the past it's been like, as Dorothy was saying, like it's a natural disaster. It's if it's not going to be a natural disaster, it's not going to affect your character. So therefore, either you're going to make a movie about a natural disaster or you're not going to include climate change. But I think if we start to think about what climate change is actually doing to us now as sort of just human beings kind of moving through the world, what it's doing to our children, which is really significant. I mean, you talk to like, Gen Xers or even the younger children at this point, and the idea of like climate change is a major psychological stressor for them. They're learning about it and they know it's coming and they don't know what the adults are doing about it. So thinking about, I think climate change on that level, on a character level, like for this character, what she's worried about, she's worried about her marriage, she's worried about her children, she's worried about the legacy of her parents, and she's trying to protect them in many different ways. And one of them is basically like protecting their ability to breathe. But it's really sort of wrapped up in not just like climate itself, but the kind of psychosis that she's struggling with on all levels. So that's something that I think, as storytellers, we can start to think about, if we can take climate change like kind of out of the meta, as Dorothy was saying, and put it into kind of like the micro experience that we're all actually having. I think it becomes much, the sort of dramatic possibilities become much more apparent.
Yeah, and the idea that you boil it down to the emotional experience of a human, as opposed to the 50-page report filled with numbers, and you end up with fear or anxiety or hope or confusion. So thank you for that. Rosario, when I introduced you, I set you up as someone who's been in so many different types of stories. You've been on stage and on screen. How do you approach this? How do you think about this challenge of integrating climate into narrative? And ideally telling a story that isn't just doom and gloom. But if you've had any experiences or perspectives on that, now is the time.
Well, I think, especially in Hollywood, we tell very American stories, right, that center the individual. So there's this great Grace Lee Boggs quote: "You don't choose the times you live in, but you do choose who you want to be, and you do choose how you want to think." And one of the things about what we believe really comes so much more from how we feel about things than necessarily the individual facts. So that's what we have with storytelling, is a way to compel people to hearing the urgency of these different issues. And you can do that. We've seen that in so many different stories, from, a Bond movie, Quantum of Solace, that is centering the privatization of water as the big enemy, or in documentaries. And yes, a lot of documentaries, because we get so much of our storytelling, again, from the individual. So it's the hero's journey all the way to the doom and gloom stuff, because it's very, it translates urgency. And it's also very good for fundraising, and it's really good for getting stuff out, right? Because, if you say we've got this many years of topsoil left, you can kind of get people to be more vigilant. I think one of the key aspects of really transforming how Hollywood changes those stories, and how comes from the environmental groups, kind of transforming and shifting how those stories are told about what our possibilities are. But also from Hollywood itself, also having gatekeepers change. Because when you look at who are the gatekeepers of our stories, they're the same gatekeepers in philanthropy and economics and our food systems. It's very white and it's very male. And to really transform these issues, we're going to have to push against the status quo. And those are the people who most benefit from the status quo. So to really transform how we do things is going to take a real shift in power. And that's going to come from a lot more women, as you see on this panel, speaking up and being able to voice these possibilities, but also people of color and those communities being centered, as they are the ones that are the most hard hit by environmental injustice. And seeing, if you center Indigenous people in these stories, they have always been a champion of the world, and the fact that we are on a living, breathing planet. We don't need to, like in movies like Interstellar, start imagining how we have to go to other planets in order to sustain humanity, but actually thinking about the solutions of what we can do here to make this world for all of us.
Whew, that was a word. Thank you for laying that out. You touched on a lot. You brought up a lot. And the individual hero story, the American-centeredness, the embrace of something new, like maybe optimism, and of course, the P word, power, and who has long had it and how what's required to save ourselves and still live on this planet is a dramatic shift in how power is used. And that may be threatening to some who've historically had it. So there may be some association, if not causation, between the lack of movement and the movement that we need and demand. Christiana, in your book, you talk about some of what's required in terms of our attitude change, a collective attitude change to embrace some new attitudes of optimism maybe and let go of some things. Can you talk more about what you think is required culturally to get to a place where we can have that more positive climate future?
Well, to resonate with what my friends have just said, we have to get beyond the doom and gloom. I just, do not see where doom and gloom, true as it is, because if we don't change our ways, we are really doomed. But as Rosario said, we know that we have had enough information, and it hasn't made that big of a difference. So we have to mentally first go beyond the doom and gloom and say, right, I understand that reality could become the reality. But however, contrast to that, what can we actually do about that? Do we have to accept it as our only destiny? Or can we actually create a better and much, much healthier future for all of us? That is and it's a mental shift, right? It's getting us out of the victim mode that whatever has happened in the past, whoever did it, now we are the victims of that, and especially future generations are victims of that. Getting ourselves out of the victim mode, crawling out of that box and saying, I have agency. I have agency, and it is only through actually acting on our personal responsibility or on the responsibility of whatever sphere of influence we have under us that we actually begin to feel that we don't have to be in this doom and gloom, that we're not going to be forever punished, that we do have the possibility to do something. That's how you begin to engender a positive, optimistic sense that something can be done by all of us, so that collectively we can create a very different future. But we have to crawl out of that doom and gloom box, right? And out of the victim and say, we, at this point, the human race, we humans have never, ever been as powerful as we are right now. We're holding the future of the whole species and of this planet in our hand. That could not have been said by our parents. And by the time the next generation comes to the tables of decision, it will be too late. So here we are, right? All the adults at the table right now are absolutely privileged in our capacity and our responsibility and the opportunity to set our minds to this and say, yes, we know that we're up against a very steep hill, but we can climb it. We can climb it and we can be victors. We do not have to be victims. We can be victors, but we have to imagine what that future looks like, because whatever we can't imagine, we cannot create. So the power of storytelling, the power of visualization, the power of every single one of the visual and plastic arts media and written, all of that is incredibly powerful, because we have to use that as a magnet to pull us toward a different future, as opposed to the doom and gloom that pushes us into a dark box.
Christiana, you are our magnet right now, and you are pulling us toward that future with the sheer force of your being. Thank you for saying it so plainly and nudging all of us, shoving all of us toward that different way of embracing the story of who we are. On the subject of stories, I want to come back to you, Dorothy, about your new Apple TV Plus show with Scott Z. Burns. I know there's a climate, through line in it. Can you talk a bit about it and what you're pushing into with that story and how you've, evolved in your own way of talking about climate and story?
So we're thinking of the story as a series of extrapolations. So it's, if this particular trend goes in this direction, what would that look like? And those really have all different forms. So it's spanning the 21st century and really trying to imagine different possibilities, positive and negative. I think that's something that really matters, is it's not only, what happens if the worst possible decision is made at every decision fork, but like, what if a good decision is made? What if a crazy decision is made? Just there are lots of different places. So it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. It's not evenly distributed, right? Like climate change is not going to land on every single person with the same force and power. And we want to make sure that we, address that and show that in our storytelling.
Sarah, I'm going to temporarily put you in charge of all of Hollywood. There, you're in charge of all of Hollywood now. You have all the power. Me. Maybe. What decisions do you make? What do you change? Not about necessarily specific stories that get greenlit, but even the process, the power, the structure of how the industry itself works to try to produce a different set of story outcomes that can produce a different set of realities for us to live in.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can all just accept that, because we're not so far. I mean, some people on this call, I think, obviously have not been living in denial for a lot longer. But we are not so far away from people still arguing as to whether or not climate change is even a real thing. And when we did the last season of The Affair, we got a lot of blowback from people, saying like, why did this show get political? And from my perspective, we were not getting political. We were just projecting 30 years into the future and acknowledging that things were going to change, and actually in some ways we had to pull way back on what, people were telling us would be the reality of 30 years from the future, not just from a climate change perspective, also, from a technological perspective, because we kept saying like a little future goes a long way. So I'd like to just start there. And I do agree with you that if we could start there, not only in our storytelling, but also on our sets, and also in terms of the way that we use resources on our sets, and just if we could be the change that we want to see in the world. And I think that the idea that we have to get positive about it and we have to project a future that is that people want to see and they want to be hopeful about, I find incredibly inspirational. And it's actually a bit of a leap for me. Not being like where you guys are in terms of having spent a lot of time, or your entire careers thinking about this.
So I've had occasion to have a meeting or 100 with Hollywood executives in my day. And when I've tried to pitch climate-related stories, I get one of two responses. The first is, it's too complicated, AKA our audience is a bunch of dum-dums, so why bother? The second is, if you want to tell a positive story about a climate future, I don't know if that's entertaining. Like it's just going to be this corny, naive, silly story. I'd love to hear from everyone on this panel. If you've had this experience, you've gotten this feedback before, and how would you respond to it? What do you believe the best response to it is? Christiana, I'll start with you, but I want to hear from everybody.
Well, yes, if you want, climate can be very complex, for sure, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be, because ultimately, bottom line, it's about who we know ourselves to be and how do we show up in the world and how do we engage with power. And we're taking those decisions all the time anyway. So it's just a question of, waking up to consciousness and understanding who do we really want to be? What do we want to contribute? How do we want to transport ourselves? How do we want to feed our bodies? Do we want to feed our bodies junk, or do we want to feed our bodies healthy food? Do we want to transport ourselves by just sitting for a very long time in some vehicle that is contaminating the city and the planet? Or do we actually want to have more active transport or cleaner transport if it's longer distances? Who do we want to vote for? Now that we are into very, very political times in the United States, who do we vote for at federal level, at city level, at state level? What products do we buy? Which companies do we actually turn to for the choice of our products and services? Do we turn to companies that are still being completely irresponsible? Or do we turn to companies that have turned the page and understand that they have a very important role to play in solving global issues, including climate change, but not just global issues like inequality, like gender injustice, like racial injustice? There are many companies that have woken up and understood that they should and can contribute to that. And we should be turning our attention, our consumption capacity to those companies and not to the others. So it doesn't have to be that complex. It's a question of waking up to consciousness and being very aware of everything that we do.
And as a storytelling note, what you just described is very dramatic. It could be very entertaining. The pitched battles inside the companies to compete for the future consumer. Dorothy, how do you respond to this idea of there being a choice between entertainment and portraying something positive, or the complexity of it to begin with? Yeah.
I mean, I think any story can and probably should be a climate change story. I think it's sort of like, are walls entertaining? Like, I don't know, but most TV shows have them. Like, climate change is just as much a part of our reality as walls. So like, it should be in TV shows as much as walls are. And like, maybe the episode is about the walls, or maybe they're just there, but they influence everybody's decisions because you have to go, around them or through a door or whatever. Like, it's a fact. You wouldn't say to somebody like, I don't know. Yeah, it's like, I don't know, gravity seems like a little dull. Could we just do this show without gravity? Like, that would actually be a ton of work to try to make a TV show without gravity. So I think there's a part of me that feels like if we just made the small adjustment to make it reality, that would be enormous. And sometimes it would be at the center and it would be like, ooh, this person was murdered because of climate change. And sometimes it would just be like, well, we're solving the murder, but we can't get to the murder location because there was a flood, and that's going to hold up our murder investigation. But it would just be there. It would just be true. So I think that would be my first thing. And then my second thing is a little bit more gooey and abstract, which is that I think any story that gets at the way that we conceive of ourselves is also a climate story. And to the extent that we conceive of ourselves as individuals, or the extent that we conceive of ourselves as citizens of the globe, that's a climate story. Any story that's about, individual versus community, any story that's about understanding yourself as a politically embedded actor with, political ramifications to your choices, those are all inherently about climate as well. So I think, the more that we tell stories that just show people trying to understand who they are in the world, the more those will have climate ramifications too.
You killed me with the gravity and the walls thing. That's the takeaway. Whenever you're watching this panel, you're going to hear more brilliance. You've heard a lot of super smart stuff. Does your show have walls and gravity? Then it can have climate. I mean, that's it. That's a wrap. Sarah or Rosario, on this topic of what can be entertaining, Is there something you're trying to add?
Yeah, just in terms of following up with what Dorothy said, I do think, again, people who write relationship-based dramas, which, or comedies or whatever, what most of us are doing, we have a relationship with the climate as well. And I think the thing that I found strange when I started to realize that the weather was changing was I realized that when I was a child, I took the weather for granted. Like the idea that there would always be seasons was not something that I ever, that I didn't entertain the loss of the seasons. But what I've learned as an adult being on this planet is that like everything is a relationship. And in the way that you treat other people, you can't treat other people like shit and expect their relationship to stay, and to endure. We can't treat our climate like shit and expect our climate to stay and endure. And I think just for me, just making that change in my own head to think of my relation, as you were saying earlier, Rosario, in terms of like a relationship to the planet as an active, living, breathing thing that we have to take care of if we want it to take care of us. I mean, I know I'm not the first person to say this, but I hadn't really thought about it on a storytelling level, until recently. And now that I do, it sort of changes the way that I think of everything, like the place, the planet, the environment is always part of your story. As Dorothy's saying, you can no longer exclude it and just assume, that it wouldn't change. It is also a changeable force.
Ooh, yes. Okay, Rosario, anything to add on this particular topic? More focused. I know you're working on this project La Boriqueña with the NRDC. Is kind of in the works. If you can share something about it, get us even more inspired about the potential here, and also just brag on yourself a little.
So La Borinqueña is a comic book character that is an Afro-Latina Puerto Rican girl from New York who gets her powers when she goes back to La Isla, and she can fly because she can manipulate air and she can, manipulate water. And, it's very natural based. Her powers are based kind of on spirituality. And, what's really beautiful about it is, the Edgardo, who is the creator of her, has been utilizing her for a really beautiful thing. So he created a book called Reconstruction, and over $150,000, 100% of the proceeds of the book go towards hurricane relief on the island. Over $150,000 has already been raised. So I think that's where we're at in storytelling, where we can use a comic book character to bring attention to climate change, where we can tell stories like chasing coral, chasing ice, where we are highlighting with these documentaries what is happening to our coral reefs, what is happening to our glaciers, what is happening to our planet, but also really show the innovations and the inspiring stories that are coming and the solutions that are coming from people who are becoming aware of this and not just being scared of it, but seeing themselves as full actors in transformation.
What she said. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists so very much. You are climate heroes. You are human heroes. You are rewriting our future in a better way. And it has been a true honor to be a part of this with you. Thank you, Sundance, for inviting all of us to be a part of this 2021 virtual festival. And thank you to the audience for attending.
Christiana, Sarah, Dorothy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So much thanks to our incredible story future rewriting panelists, to Sundance for inviting us to be part of the 2021 virtual festival, and to you in the audience for attending. Thanks for showing up. Beyond Apocalypse is part of a series of discussions about climate storytelling and entertainment. Upcoming panels will focus on climate psychology and emotions, on climate change and COVID, and a buyer side panel with studio and network executives. For more information about the series or Rewrite the Future, stay tuned for contact information on the next screen. And before we get to that, just personally, as Baratunde, as the host of a podcast called How to Citizen, thank you for citizening as a verb. Thank you for showing up. And thank you for living into this idea, which I have long believed that much of our reality is just our story experience of it. And that when we shape stories, we help shape the world. That is an incredible power. And as Christiana said, we have more power now than at any point in our species' history. So I'm glad to see us using this power, and I encourage us to continue using this power to rewrite the future better. Thanks.